Yes, so hello everyone and welcome to Copenhagen or to this first webinar in the spring series of ISQE webinars. I have the pleasure of introducing today's speaker, and it is Peter Levine, who is a professor of citizenship and associate dean at Tufts University. So Peter, take it away.
Oh, thanks so much, Morten and Brendan and everybody for being here. Looking forward to the conversation, and I'm gonna show PowerPoint and present basically 11 ideas. It says the ideas right at the top of each slide, and they add up to sort of a beginning of a theory. And I'm hoping to do that in 30 minutes, so we have lots of time for discussion left. And as I go, please don't hesitate to ask questions that are sort of clarifications or confusion or whatever, corrections. But I think if you would hold big substantive comments for the end, we'll have more time to dig into them, if that's okay with everybody. So thanks again for being here, and I'm going to share my slides. Too many windows open. Here it is. All right, so yeah, so each slide has a statement at the top, and then at the end I'll show you all 11 in a row. I really should make it 10 because you have 10 theses for your theory, right? You can't have 11. It's ridiculous, but I have 11. So the first one should be pretty intuitive, I would think, for this group, although a lot of people wouldn't think this way. But it's the idea that when you have when you encounter a person and you try to find out what moral and political ideas they have, what values they hold, what they actually have is a structure of ideas connected by various links. So this is an example of a real individual's views about the issue of abortion as described in text, and then working with two colleagues who are much better at text analysis than I am, they extracted a network and showing that these are the ideas this person holds, and those ideas are connected in that way. So that, I would imagine, is pretty familiar to people like you guys. This is work of the same point here. This is a person. It's an individual. It's actually a 38-year-old Asian American man whose favorite politician is Bernie Sanders. I'll explain why I'm interested in that later. But here I derived this person's network in a little bit different way, and I'll share that just in case you're interested methodologically. I have taken to asking people survey questions in which first they say what they believe in. So this person said that he strongly believed with each of those statements that's on the map, like I believe in less corporate influence on government, or I believe in more spending on the environment. And then I show them pairs and I ask them if each one is a reason for the other. And so this person is saying, for example, that racial justice is a reason for free college for all, and racial justice is a reason for health insurance for all, but racial justice and more spending on the environment are not connected. And so I've been extracting that kind of information. I will say it gets very complicated if you ask a bunch of questions, and I've been interested in asking questions that are not just, about a bunch of issues, but also different kinds of connections. So I'll ask, is something a reason for something else? Is something a cause of something else? I've been asking these hypothetical questions. If something changed, would you be more likely to support something else? If A changed, would you be more likely to support B? So I'm illustrating that with a portion of someone's network. A 33-year-old white woman who also likes Sanders a lot. And if you followed this through from the top right, she thinks that if government were less corrupt, she'd be more likely to support reparations for slavery. And I didn't ask her why, but I think you could imagine that you would be more likely to support a big government program if you thought the government was trustworthy. Then reparations for slavery would be a reason or a cause of a lot of important issues, such as, generally racial. It would cause more racial justice. It would cause a reduction in the incarceration rate and so on. So I find that interesting example of sort of structure in her thinking. She has a hypothetical, at least as elicited here, and we could talk about whether this is valid, but at least as elicited here, she has a a kind of hypothetical. So she's probably less likely to support reparations for slavery, given that she, in fact, probably doesn't think the government is trustworthy. So the second point is an individual's network structure, the design of their network as we elicit it, might predict important things. Otherwise, who cares, basically? So this is the validity question. Why would we care what structure people have? So I've been exploring, so I'm proposing that it matters, and that I've been trying to explore that in different contexts. In this particular study, what I did was I had a sample of 100 representative American progressives, left of center, and asked and elicited the kind of maps that you've already seen for each of them. And what I find is that, and then I asked them which of 5 sort of well-known American politicians they like most. Well, I asked them to rank these 5 American politicians. They're all, for those coming from other countries, they're all left of center American politicians, but they span from quite far left to very moderate. And they have other differences, for example, demographics. And what I find is that the model that works best for predicting which one they will support is a model which looks at the centrality of the issues in their network. So if you just ask them, what issues do you care about or believe in, you don't get much predictive power. You can't tell what they'll vote, who they'll support. But if you ask them about, if you give an elicited network and you try to figure out what's central, then, for example, those who don't think that mass imprisonment is very central are more likely to support Joe Biden, who's one of the least likely candidates to do anything about mass incarceration. Hope I'm not going too fast, but this next slide might just give a different way of demonstrating the same information. So here I used ENA, epistemic network analysis software. And I sort of entered the information for all those who really liked Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, US Congresswoman, very charismatic, I think very brilliant, also quite far left for our political spectrum, or those who liked her least. And I entered the information, and you get 2 different kinds of network. This is aggregating all the people in those categories. And you get 2 different kinds of networks. They differ on the horizontal axis. And my read of the horizontal axis, you'd have to stare at this for a while to figure out if you agree, but my read of the horizontal axis is that it has to do with whether you're more concerned with programs and remedies that address particular identity groups in the United States, or kind of general system change. So if you're more interested in things like LGBTQ equity or reparations, you're more for AOC, for Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And if you're less interested in that, you rank her lower. And that's statistically significant. One quick point about methodology here. I don't know if other people use ENA software this way. And I'm mentioning it very quickly in this context of our group, because I assume you have some familiarity. But I didn't code any text data. I didn't have them write or say anything. I put in pairs of ideas that they had explicitly connected. So I'm just not sure that's been done that much, but you can do it. It's easy. All right, next point. Colleagues and I are hypothesizing that people are going to tend to have similar structures to their networks, no matter what, or at least they'll often, the same structure will recur regardless of what topic you're talking about. Because, and I came up with this because I feel like I encounter people who have highly centralized network structures on everything that they talk about. Everything's organized, and it's organized around a few central points, and that's how they think. Other people who don't connect things at all much, and other people have very kind of flat networks where everything kind of connects to everything else, but there's no center. I thought this was the case, so we began to kind of try to, well, I believed it might be the case. So we tried to explore it. So first of all, this is from a paper by Nick Beauchamp, Sarah Sugars, and me. And this is just an illustration, which all you probably know, that networks have different forms, different typologies. So these are completely hypothetical networks, just showing you that they can take a different form. The one on the right, for example, is much more centralized, with one node playing a much more important role. What we did is we elicited network structures from people on 3 different issues: healthcare, abortion, and one other, parenting. And we basically found that people tended to have the same kind of network. We also did it in 3 different ways. We used text, we used a diagramming software, and we used a little bot which interviewed them. And we found that they tended to have the same kind of network structures, and also that those network structures tended to correlate with personality traits. So, you know, those with, I didn't memorize this graph all that well, but those with high conscientiousness which is a standard personality trait, tended to have high degree, average degree centrality in their networks. So this is very preliminary, but I'm going around in the world thinking that the people I encounter and that you encounter tend to be somewhat reliable in the kinds of networks they have. All right. So this next point is, when we discuss with other people, what we're doing is we're disclosing and sharing portions of our network, because you make a point, you state something, and you're really you're asking for it. You're promising that, in a sense, that you could say why, and you could say what implications that point has. You are for marriage equality, and when you say that, you have to be able to say things about what you think about marriage and equality and sexual equality and so on. And so what we do when we talk is we disclose portions of our network. So this is the paper that we actually presented at, or that Brendan actually presented at the conference this fall. This is by David Williamson Schaefer, Brendan Igan, and me. And what we did was we used the text from two conversations about the same topic. The topic was the social determinants of health, what causes people to be have bad health. And the conversations were at Kansas State University in the center of the US and Tufts University. Tufts University is often seen as kind of a liberal bubble, and Kansas State is more diverse ideologically. And these are probably familiar graphs to many of you. That obviously, if they're not, they'd be hard to understand. But the blue graph is the Tufts conversation. The red graph, is it red? I'm colorblind. Yeah, I'm literally colorblind. The red graph is Kansas State, and the graph in the middle shows the difference. And our main claim, Brendan and David and my main claim, is that this is this method of mapping a conversation has face validity. Because what you see here really is that at Kansas State, there's a kind of triangular conversation with social class, race and ethnicity, and also people's individual experience growing up. For example, the values that were in their family as the three big issues that they're talking about. And at Tufts, they don't talk about that upbringing, this thing at the top right, because basically lefties don't believe in that. That is to say, that's to blame the victim for social inequality. So they didn't talk. I mean, I'm trying not to make a value judgment. Actually, I probably would agree with the Tufts people, but I think that it's valid on its face, because the conversation at Tufts was not about upbringing, and the conversation at KSU was. So next point, it's not that we have some elaborate network that we're completely conscious of in our heads and we go around with that all the time. Rather, we're dynamic. We're in conversation with other people, and our networks both, we explore, remember, and develop and even change our networks in conversation with other people. So they're not static, and they don't pre-exist a conversation in a simple way. What I'm demonstrating here is, for a few years ago, I've recruited about 20 friends, literally people I cared about. And we're also in my geographical area. And I did these interviews with them to talk about the things that they cared about most and to ask them what was connected to which. And so this is one individual's network that came out from these conversations. And the reason I'm displaying it is because I was very conscious that I was no doubt affecting the network that emerged. If this was a certain kind of scientific research project and I was trying to find out what they really thought without the researcher influencing it, then I failed. Because I'm sure this was a dynamic, this was partly what I asked and how I talked about it. And that's a sort of a challenge methodologically, but it's a reality about our world. So this is a graph of somebody's network. I don't think it's my network. I think it's their network, but it's their network in conversation with Peter. And I think we're always in conversation with people. All right. Going back to this point about people having different network structures, I would hypothesize that some networks are better than others for conversation. So, I mean, part of this comes out of the frustration I feel when, for example, you talk to somebody who everything goes back to one point, right? They only have one point, whether it's, a classic Marxist who thinks everything is about the struggle of the working class, or a fundamentalist who thinks it's all about God or whatever, but you can't route around it in network terms. And it's also frustrating when somebody has no connections, when they just say this and they can't say why. So here are two actual networks that we elicited in that first study by Nick and Sarah and me. And I would say that person on the left is easier to talk to than the person on the right, because the person on the left has lots of different ideas and they're connected. And if I don't agree about something, I can route around that and talk with that person. Now, this 0.6 is a hypothesis. It is not a fact at all. Maybe none of this is a fact, but this is definitely a hypothesis. I haven't done any research to show that it's that actually network structures affect conversation quality, but that's the next idea, which is to elicit network structures, then put people in conversation, and then independently evaluate the quality of the conversation and see if network structures predicts quality. 7, okay, so a given idea is more likely, what causes ideas to spread in a society? I would say, I'm gonna just hypothesize that this, I have no evidence for this really, but it's 3 things. A is well known. This is, everybody talks about this. It's an idea will spread if the people who spread it are connected, right? If they have social network centrality. So we learned that from sociology. That's well known. Second point, it's promoted by people who are influential. That is, people who other people would regard as being trustworthy or credible in some way. So, and that's also pretty well known. So you have to be in a social network and you have to be influential in it. If you're in a social network, but everybody thinks you're a fool, you don't have as much influence. But the third point is where I would like to say something that might be a little more closer to original. I'm not sure if it is, which is if all the people in a social network, so here we're talking about a social network, but if all the people in a social network each have idea networks, epistemic networks, then an idea will spread better if it fits in your network. So if Brendan, who I can see on my screen, gives me an idea, but it doesn't belong in my existing network, it is either contradictory to or it has no connection to my existing network, I'm not going to accommodate it as easily as if, and this is just a way of saying cognitive dissonance, but it's a way of saying cognitive dissonance in a network sense. So the graph is just of a classic social network connection, which I did for a project. It's showing which Twitter accounts, which tweets I think influence which tweets. But I would argue that their influence is partly due to the network structure of the individual's thought. Okay, so then when you have a whole population, you can characterize a network for the whole population. Now it'll have variation because everybody's different, but it may have some central tendency, something that looks like an agreement or a consensus. So, in the first study that I talked about, where I looked at 100 American progressives, well, first of all, we could just characterize them by ranking what they voted for. So the most popular idea, 80 of them chose it, was a health insurance for all. The second most popular was a solution to climate change, and down the list. The list is just a ranking. But what I'm showing is that if instead of ranking how often they chose it, you ranked how central it was, you get you get some interesting patterns. So for example, a solution to climate change is not a reason for other things. It falls dramatically down because it's something you do for its own sake. Other things are a reason for it. It's not a reason for other things. According to this sample, you might actually disagree, but according to these 100 people, it's quite a pattern. On the other hand, less corporate influence on government goes up by 7 ranks when you ask whether it's a reason for other things. People don't want that for its own sake. They want it to change they want it because of its consequences. So what I'm doing here is I'm characterizing the shared thinking of the group, obviously also with some degree of disagreement. 2 colleagues and I, Sarah Sugars again, and Louise Dubé, and I did this in a much more pragmatic context. We were trying to develop an agenda for an actual advocacy coalition, for civic education in the US. And we had about 6,000 members. It's a real coalition. It's called Civics Now. There's about 6,000 members. We wanted to get their input on how to think about the topic, but we didn't want to poll them on what would you do or what's most important, because I don't know, we didn't think they would be reliable. I could say more about why not. So instead, we asked them what they observed as issues, and then we asked them which issue affected which issue. We gave them one of these surveys where you're asked pairings, and then we derived a network diagram based on consensus. So these arrows basically reflect lots of people agreeing. So for example, lots of people think that if schools made civic education a priority, youth would be more knowledgeable, which is actually kind of duh, but it was also validating. But some of the findings are, so they also thought that if teachers were well prepared to teach civics, youth would be more knowledgeable. For example, if teachers were more well prepared to teach civics, it wouldn't affect how civically engaged young people were. Those two dots are not connected. And so we tried to use this to validate a kind of theory, a strategy for the community. So anyway, the point I'm generally making here is the one at the top of the screen, which is that a population might share a network structure. So then when a population comes to agree on a norm due to the diffusion processes that I described before, when they come to agree on some idea, it becomes a norm. So we've seen that, let's say, with marriage equality going from fairly unpopular to dominant view in a country like Australia and many other countries. I think Copenhagen was the first city in the world, right? But anyway, so that's an example. So a norm is meaningful because a norm is something that you can expect other people to agree on and even to follow without knowing them, right? You can make an assumption that other people will follow. That's what I'm using the word norm in that sense. A norm is something that you can assume other people will follow. So norms have considerable power. And in fact, institutions are heavily composed of norms. And so this is an explanation for how we would get to norms. Then here's the 10th point. I've only got 2 more. I think I'm on time pretty much. A community or let's say a culture. And I think we could use either word in this sentence. Community or culture is a single network that encompasses disagreement. So I told you earlier, I talked to 20 friends about what they believed in, and everybody had a very heterogeneous network, as you might imagine. This is highly qualitative in a sense. People could say what they believed in and then talk about the connections. But then I showed them each other's networks, and we looked for points of agreement. We looked for sentences that were close enough that both people agreed they were saying the same thing. And also, to some extent, people said, oh, yeah, no, I agree with what he said. I want to put that on my network. And so we got this. We got one network for the group, which is actually, and the colors show each individual, and it happens to be completely connected. Completely connected. On one hand, I wouldn't say that every community is going to be completely connected. I don't know how I would prove that. On the other hand, it is interesting that this group is connected because there was a lot of disagreement. I mean, just for an example, there was a very devout Catholic woman originally from Colombia, and there was an atheist, actually a humanist minister, so an aggressive atheist. And they're actually only 2 steps removed. So one of his points was there is no God, and one of her points was God is love. And those points are actually only 2 or 3 steps removed. They go by way of shared commitments to humility, which they both hold very strongly. So you could say that everybody disagrees. There's no 2 people who have the same views, but in a sense, you could go from, as long as you're able to leave one person's head and go into another person's head, you could go from one idea to another and get across the whole community. And so I find this, I use this as a kind of a visual image of a culture. And I would argue that if you could do this for the entire world, it would be a highly connected global network. Now, I don't know if it would be completely connected. Would there be some gap somewhere in the world? But I would actually be a little surprised if it were, because everybody's different and everybody's adjacent to other people. And so the point is not that human beings all share some fundamental values. I doubt that, but more that everybody's in one web of disagreement and connection. And actually, that's something that I was already thinking in 1995. So this is, I guess, indulging myself. This is a little bit, I shouldn't do this, but this is actually a diagram from a book I wrote in 1995, which is a long time ago, where I said that there's this kind of modern, figure 1, a modern paradigm for thinking about culture, where everybody belongs in a culture and every culture has a certain number of people in it, and the cultures are all different. And that this had broken down, and the postmodern paradigm is one in which each individual has a different set of values, beliefs, and so on, and they overlap across the whole world. And so those diagrams are actually not put in network terms. They are sort of sets, but I would now describe them in network terms. So that's it. Those are the points. So I'm going to actually, I think, take the slide off the screen so that I can see everybody's faces better. But I would say those are the 11 points, just in case anybody wants to kind of take a quick scan at them. but I think I will, instead of looking at them, I will let this go
Chemical
away.
hazard Medford Somerville campus. Pearson Chem Lab, 62 Talbot Avenue. Building evacuated. Oh,
Did everybody hear that?
Who has to? And
So there's a chemical spill somewhere on the Tufts University campus, but it's not in my house. So yeah, they're gonna now reach me in every possible way. So this is
At least they're making sure you're safe, Peter.
they're also gonna text me and email
Okay.
me. So,
Thanks
but
for
I would
great-
not worry about it if I were you, unless you're in Tufts University's medical school campus in downtown Boston. Otherwise, I think you can relax. Okay, so are there questions in
There are
chat?
a bunch of questions. Yes. So, but thanks a lot for very inspiring talk. We have a bunch of rather specific questions. Maybe we start with those. Your talk made me think. So, and you're also clever. So, I guess it also made you think. So let's think about what are the points that we are going to ask Peter to discuss when he's done fixing the smaller things here. So I'll leave it. The first question is from Presley about the details of the methodology without coding and doing the GNA. So Presley, can you state your question, or does it make sense to you, Peter?
Yeah. So actually, I'd love to talk about this and to plant the idea with all of you in case you want to do something similar. So I've been interested in directly asking people about the relationship between their ideas. So it's a survey, and what you see is all these questions which are randomly generated, where it says, "Do you believe that? Is this a reason for this? Is this a reason that you believe this?" I think a lot of the work in ENA that I know is using the close location of ideas in sentences and inferring. And I get the multiple values to the latter thing, including that you can use a lot more text. But I'm interested in the former, in asking people about the explicit connections, partly because I have an agenda here, which is shared by some other people to, so let me just say, a lot of you are not involved in political science or anything like political science. There's a very, very skeptical view of the public's intelligence that's prevalent in political science today. Lou Friedland, I want to know if you agree, but I think, so there are prominent books which basically say people are idiots. And so you're not going to be able to, if you ask them survey questions and you run factor analysis on the surveys, you find that they have no structure of their ideas, they're idiots. And I just think that if people have complexity and consciousness to their thought, we wouldn't capture it with that method. I don't want to go too much in detail. So I'm interested in doing something that I think of as a mark of kind of rationality, which is first you say what you think about a bunch of things. Second, you prioritize them, because I always make people pick their top issues. And third, you address whether they connect. And the paper that I've got under review is basically, and I don't know what the reviewers will think because it's a bit of a weird paper, but I'm basically the argument of it is that people give pretty valid and meaningful responses when they're asked those questions that way. And also, I mean, I have a little worry about ENA, but maybe I shouldn't have it, which is that the mere co-location of ideas doesn't tell you why people are putting them together, and that it might make a lot of difference whether they think one thing is a moral cause of a moral reason for another thing, or an empirical cause of another thing, or etc. Yeah.
Thank you, Peter. This is just to, I mean, as I understood the question here was, how did you actually do that? And you simply asked people, is this idea close to this one? And then you mark the connection. So that's
Yeah, that's right.
That's Amanda, you have a question about the networks in.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So actually, it's actually on reflection, a pretty specific question, and I would love to hear the answer, but it may not be of interest to everyone. So might I suggest a broader question that emerged as I listened to the whole talk, which is that you brought all of these beautiful visualization techniques, a rich sort of variety of different ways to show underlying patterns that are happening across different phenomena, people's self-reflections, people's connections to each other. And I'm curious, as you're going through data and trying to understand different phenomena, how do you choose from this rich tapestry of different techniques and approaches to visualize information? How do you choose which one is the best for each question that you're asking?
So, I mean, thank you for liking them, but you know, to some extent, what all I did here was copy graphics from different papers that I've worked on with different people. So it's a little more random than it seemed. I was trying to illustrate, I was trying to make it a little bit cheerful with colors and things, but really, there's been a bunch of different constellations of co-authors. So in some ways, I don't know the answer to your question. Was it Amanda who asked? I don't know the answer to your question. That is, I'm not very good at this. This is sort of network visualization, network science, which I'm just kind of learning. One thing I might share is that map for the coalition, which is based on Kumu, that's the Kumu.io software. I thought that went pretty well for a big group of lay people. I mean, it required obviously some explanation, but I think they actually kind of related to that pretty well. So that's one thing I've learned. But I would love to hear more about what kinds of visualizations make sense to you all.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a question I get from my students often. So.
Thank you. So I made a choice here that we now move to the more like conceptual questions. So maybe I forgot some important questions, and then you just restated, right? So I'm thinking Jamie first about lived experience versus network. So you asked the question, have you looked into how lived experience?
Yeah, I can kind of try to reiterate. Maybe my ideas will be a little more clear if I speak them. Excellent presentation, by the way. I'm really interested in the broader concepts and how humans think and arrive at certain ideas. I'm doing my research looking at lived experience. And so I'm really interested to know whether or not you've looked into how people's lived experiences influence their personal networks or the overall networks of your sample, and or was maybe this something that was just inherently existent in the sample that you assumed was there? How did you determine that, or did you look at that?
Well, I don't think I've done a good enough job on it. I think it's a really super question, and that should be part of the agenda. I have almost all these studies ask demographic questions. To some extent, they're functioning as kind of control variables. So you're trying to see whether the structure of the network matters controlling for other things, or the relationship between the network and I guess underlying that is the idea that things like race or gender or age would they're very crude proxies for background experience, and they would relate to things like, do you like which candidate do you like? I mean, we know that young people like AOC more than older people. But I also think they are extremely crude, which is why they don't end up being statistically significant in some of the models, because you can't tell from somebody's age and race and gender what they think, right? I mean, that would be very reductive. So I guess, I'm just going to process what you're saying and think about it later. I think what we'd probably want to do is ask much more nuanced questions about experience and background, and maybe try to bring them into the network somehow. So I'll say too, my next, got a couple of projects in the sort of, not on the back burner. I'm trying to do them. And one of them is actually to do a study of a religious congregation, trying to get as many people in the congregation as possible to participate. And there, the idea is partly that they have affective connections, but they also have a shared sort of set of values, but they also have disagreement. So I think I've found a nice rabbi in California who's willing to let me loose on his congregation. And this would be a perfect example of a time, because we'd be able to know that they had some background situation in common, because they're all members of the congregation, although could ask how long they've been and how involved they are. But also we could ask specific about other things that are in which they differ.
Thank you. So next question is Louis.
Yeah, it's a quick comment to Jamie's question and Peter's answer. I think that the one way of understanding that is the embedded social network structures of influence in people's life worlds, so that life worlds are not, of course, general, or they're not they're distinct, they're organized in networks and social structures that are local and have structures of influence in them. And I think that that actually speaks to the larger question of ENA in a number of different ways as well. It's hard to do, right? Social network analysis at that level is difficult, but maybe you'll have some luck in your congregation, which is a great idea, Peter. My question was about, and I think I understood this, but I wanted to clarify, and I really love the presentation, by the way. Some of these relationships were normative or moral, well, normative and or moral. Others were cognitive or causal, right? And of course, it seemed like most of the networks that you were presenting were some mixture of the normative and the causal. And I'm wondering whether you made that distinction in your modeling at all, or whether you derived any, if first of all, I might be wrong, but if so, did you make that distinction? And second, did it matter in ways that you could see?
So I am actually, Lou and I have known each other for a long time. So I'm very skeptical of trying to make a fact value distinction in some clear way. I think that they interpenetrate in complicated ways. I'm actually interested in, so the other study, one study I want to do is this congregational study. The other study I want to do is a nationally representative sample survey, but intentionally mixing the topics that are in the moral foundations literature, which are purely moral, and a bunch of political questions, a lot of which are pretty empirical, and derive and not a priori separate them, and not guide the survey respondents to separate them. They'll actually get them in random order. So they'll get a Jonathan Haidt moral foundations question, and then they'll get a Pew Charitable Trust political question, many of which are basically empirical, like, do you think immigration helps the economy or something? And I don't believe that they will separate. Haidt does. So the whole idea of this is another literature people may or may not know, but the whole idea of moral foundations is that you have foundations which are moral, and then you kind of apply those underlie everything. And I don't think that's right. Partly, I don't think that his methodology could possibly have shown that, because he hasn't mixed them up. So he hasn't been able to see if there's a foundation structure, but I don't think so. So it's an awesome question, which is really kind of central to my interests. But what I would believe is that people mix facts and values, because the basic question we have as human beings is, what should we do? That's what we go through life doing. And that's just both empirical and normative all the way through. You don't do something if it's not going to work. And you also don't do something if it's evil. And it's like very hard to very fine distinctions between those two things. Is that how, or yeah?
Yeah, we could take it up at another time, because I think you're right, but I think that there's also some mixture of those two things in terms of causality. The last thing I'll say quickly is that we've used something called the Fisher name generator in our own research from Claude Fisher's work, where you can model people's networks in a survey very, modestly up to maybe say 5 people. And that might be a way of bridging, for example, lived experience, as we talked about a moment ago, and also the local networks of influence, and the degree of homogeneity or heterogeneity across those networks that might account for epistemic similarities. So that's just another thought.
No, that's great. I think I learned about that from you, but I did remember it, and I was thinking about doing that with the synagogue, because then we might see different clusters of people. You kind of imagine that the rabbi who has the biggest platform would be on everybody's list, but maybe not.
Yeah, maybe not.
Yeah.
Okay, so I'm trying to moderate here. It's complicated, so but it's sequential. So we have Andrew.
Thanks, Peter. That was a really interesting talk. I'm curious about, it seemed like the early theses in your list were mostly individual level, and the later ones are mostly community, population, culture level. But unless I missed it, I didn't hear you say anything about the interaction between those two. And that strikes me as a really pretty critical piece of this is what what individuals look like in the context of their cultures, communities, populations, whatever, however you're thinking of the group level, and sort of how you're theorizing that relationship. And obviously that's a big question, but I'm curious if there's room for you to stuff either a few more theses in there, or if what you see as emerging from these 11 things is something like that, maybe.
No, I mean, it's a great question. I definitely think there's a dynamic relationship between the individual and the group, even starting with a dyad, where if we just talk, we affect each other. And so it's pretty complicated. So I guess a couple points though. I mean, one is that institutions often have as their output structures of ideas, right? So a court produces opinions, university president sends out a message about COVID. I mean, institutions generate these church issues and encyclical. So a product of institutions is often some model of what we should think. But then people also have opinions about the institution, which vary internally. So some people have different opinions, but only if there's a lot of shared opinion is there a real norm inside an institution. If they don't share an endorsement of a value, but it's still like, it may be that many Russians don't agree with Putin right now. We can't tell because they can't express it. So that's not really, so agreeing with Putin is not really a norm. You can't tell if it's a norm because it's enforced. So people are affecting institutions and institutions are affecting people. And the other, so it's like super complicated. I mean, it's the whole of social science in a way, your question. But the other thing I'll say is I understand institutions as things that people belong to. Some people belong to them, right? Other people don't belong to them, but they're affected by them. So, you belong to Tufts. I belong to Tufts University. Other people might be community people who don't belong to it, but they're affected by it. Cultures are things that people have. And what they have is all the tissue of ideas and their connections. And so it might be at least helpful to think about that. So institutions are things that people belong to and that generate idea networks. And cultures are idea networks that people have and that they use. That's just a touch of it. That's one of the reasons to do the congregation study, though, because there we would have we would know the institution and the culture to some extent. We could sort of look at and I was also planning to repeat the survey 6 months later.
Okay, thank you for that answer. So we have you. You wrote the question.
Yeah, thanks, Morten, and thanks, Peter, for your sharing. I have a question about, it's actually, I think, a fundamental question about the definition of connections. So, for example, in the learning science field, we think about the connections making us the process of learning, and people are uptaking other people's idea and share and contribute on that in a conversation to make learning happen. So I wonder, how would be your definition in terms of the cognitive connection, specifically in the domain that you work on? And what are some other alternatives in general about how we define the connections?
Yeah.
Thanks.
So this is a methodologically challenging. In that study that I talked about where I just talked to my friends, I didn't constrain the connections at all. I just said, do you think these two things are connected? So the advantage of that is flexibility. They can have all different kinds of connections. The disadvantage is ambiguity. I don't know what it means. In some of the survey stuff, I've defined it really carefully. I've said, these statements like, if X changed, would that make it more likely that Y changed? So that specifies it. But then the question is, first of all, is it valid? Because are people psychologically valid? Are people really thinking that way? And also, is it kind of, I guess it's another kind of validity, but well, it's really a reliability or validity. So does it translate to anything? I mean, if people are asked these questions, are they saying anything that means anything? So obviously I think so. And I showed a little evidence in terms of the relationship between what they say and other things, but you could definitely be skeptical that people are, so if people don't otherwise think this way and they're suddenly presented with this task, is it something more like a weird game that just gets kind of random results, or is it an eliciting of their networks? And so obviously that's a big part of the agenda here, is to prove that is to try to make it actually valid.
Yep, That makes
But I would love
sense.
to
Well,
keep up. I'm sorry, go ahead. I didn't mean to interrupt.
oh, don't worry. Yeah, I think that makes sense to me. Like we need to find some evidence to support the validity of the definition of connection in different contexts. Yeah, that makes sense to me. Sorry to cut you off. Please.
No, no, I cut you off, but I would love to continue the dialogue, sort of, not necessarily today, but with what I think of as more mainstream ENA, where you, as you said, you're using co-occurrence, because I do see the advantages and one of co-occurrence, and one of them is just that the law of large numbers. You can take a lot of text and you can find co-occurrence, and then you sort of don't have to worry about exactly why things are co-occurring. But I am worried about it too. I'm worried that it's sweeping together a lot of different kinds of connections. So I think we should just try to explore. I mean, if anybody's interested, just try to explore using both methods with the same people, and try to see what difference it makes.
So I put myself on for a question now, and this was very inspiring, Peter. I have one question: is what is your? Can you explain me one more your basic elements here? Because what are the, like, the dots, and what are the lines? Because at some point it's moral issues in a group, and at some point it's more like cognitive insights in a brain. Do you understand? I mean, I'm not very good at explaining this question, but what are the dots and lines in a sense?
So it's not completely consistent across. That's the disadvantage of presenting a lot of different studies. It's not completely consistent, but in general, the dots are, at least I've come to the following view more recently than some of those studies, which is the dots should always probably be declarative sentences that a person endorses. And the lines are logical relations, although they might vary. You might be able to map multiple logical connections on the same graph, or you might want to have separate graphs. And the logical connections might be of the different kinds, as causal, what I think of as purely normative. This is a reason for that, in the sense that this is a moral reason for that, et cetera. So that's what it is. If anybody wants a sort of very highfalutin philosophical justification, the Robert Brandom is an influential philosopher at Pittsburgh, and this is really his model of reasoning, where the sentence is the minimal unit of reason, and when you state a sentence, you are promising, in a kind of game with the other participants, to give both, to be able to spell out the antecedent and consequent sentences. And I find it pretty useful. I find it a pretty good model.
Okay, thank you. Sentences, I mean, an idea network, right, with sentences and relations. So thank you for this, Sylvia.
Thanks, Peter, for the wonderful presentation. I just wanted to add a quick thought and then link that to my question concerning what you said, that insight that you said about co-occurrences being possibly anything. And I completely agree with that. I think it's an important part of analysis with ENA is going back to the data and kind of seeing what those mean. So that looping in, like, that iterative process of interpreting those connections are actually very important, I think. And so that would depend on your derived coding. And in your case, if I understand correctly, when you're looking at these pairs of statements, you're assuming that there's like a causal relationship or that there's a correlational relationship. So you also have a kind of derived coding that you're putting into defining what those pairs of ideas or concepts or whatever you're using. So my question was, have you considered looking at more than just pairs, like maybe triads of statements? And if so, would you consider using hypergraphs?
On the second, your question, the answer is I just don't know that stuff. I just don't know it. It's just beyond what I've studied. So I think I better look it up. The first thing you said, though, I just want to underline, because I think in some ways you were very kindly and subtly defending the standard ENA practice, and I think that needed to be done, right? Because it was starting to get a little bit, because I'm doing something a little different. And everyone's very polite. It was starting, the standard process of using co-occurrence was getting a little bit bashed here. And in truth, in the studies that I know, people do it carefully, and they do look at why things are connected, and that does figure into the coding, at least in the paper I did with Brendan and David. We thought about that, so I agree. So I would want this conversation to be balanced. So I appreciate that.
So I have Karen and then Stefano afterwards.
If anybody wants to work on hypergraphs with me, I'm a pretty good collaborator, but I'm not that good at math. So sorry, what was who's up?
Oh, Karin, I think you're muted, Karin.
Thanks for such thought-provoking ideas. Speaking of different kinds of connection, you're looking at political and moral values, which are have very strong emotional connections. And I wondered if you'd consider looking at the emotions associated with, say, agreement with those values or violation of those values. If you found similar networks as you do with your logic connections, you probably have a pretty high level of prediction. But it might be quite different if you found a different kind of structure or different kind of connections. And one could even look at the connections between some of the logical relationships and the emotions, which could be quite interesting.
No, I totally agree. I don't want to give the impression of just mushing everything together, but in the same way that I kind of resist the fact value distinction, I would resist the cognitive affective distinction, at least as a sharp one. I think it's a spectrum. So indeed, some of the relationships I'm asking are pretty affective for people.
Yes.
So you could look at the whole thing as pretty affective, but it would be very interesting to be more constructive in response to what you said, to really try to push the envelope on the very cognitive and the very emotional, and try to see if they work differently. The other thing that I think you can do is experimentally try to change the network by. Were you the person who put in chat? I have to scroll back to see, but you could imagine, for example, intentionally challenging somebody's idea and seeing whether it matters what their emotional commitment to the idea was. Or you could challenge their logic, or you could challenge their emotional commitment, and you could try to see which is which, which has different kinds of effects.
Well, you're talking about doing a kind of emotional induction, and you could even have them think about things that were really really pleasant and really satisfying to them, and seeing if their networks become more open, or might even be less central. I'm not sure. I have to think about that.
You could also wonder whether the whole climate of interaction causes people to have different kinds of networks. I mean, would people shrink their networks down if they felt stress or disapproval from other people? And would they let them kind of expand and proliferate if they felt safer? That's a whole different question. You might think that one of the advantages of freedom, literally freedom, is that it gives you the ability to experiment with a broader network.
Interesting. Also the I mean, there's something about dialogue or conversation that lies. I mean, you can envision the dynamics of aligning or whatever you do with these networks in some sort of a conversation, right? So I have Stefano on the list with the climate stuff. Can you state your question, Stefano?
Yes, thank you, Martin. I'm curious, Peter, because your presentation, so brilliant and so nice, made me think about this thing that I did not think before. I'm new at the ISQE, so I don't know how much is a lack of knowledge, but I think we have the tendency to start thinking about things isolated, and then we start to make relationships with things in order to comprehend better the totality. And it caught my attention that green movements or climate movements, they are more isolated in your graphics. And for example, how corporations are making influence on government, it's more related with the other nodes. And I was thinking about, can we, at least at certain points or at certain themes or at certain objects we're studying, think that a weaker connection between the nodes indicate a weaker comprehension of the totality? What do you think about that? Because we tend to make more relations between nodes when we advance in the knowledge, but it's not a rule, of course, it's not a law. But we, for example, we have the climate movement or the green movements. We have an expansion of studies that shows the relationship with climate and gender, climate and color, with Black people or white people. And we have here in South America, we have a lot of indigenous community that is from decades saying that climate change is the central node, is the node of the center, and not something that we need to reach if you think in a graphic. So I'm just sharing it with you, what you think, if you want to react in relation to it.
Sure. First of all, the news might be a little better than you think from the graphs that I showed. People actually, in the sample of American progressives that I showed, they actually prioritized environment very, very high, but they tended to think of it as a sort of downstream. That is, you do other things to save the climate. They tended not to think of saving the climate to do other things. And actually, to a large extent, that made sense to me. You don't fix the government you don't save the climate to fix the government, you fix the government to save the climate. So in a way, they were connected. But I have a different answer to you, which is, in many cases, we might think that there's really a truth of the matter, that, for example, environment is connected to race. Or in the case of our civics stuff that I showed, there's a lot of that we know that, teachers affect this or whatever. So then why are we bothering asking these questions of the public? Why not just study the issue? And part of the answer is because the public might have an insight, but part of it is to figure out what you need to educate. So I think the climate movement knows they have to teach people about the connections. And I don't think they would be too surprised to find that people don't make some of the connections they should make. So you could look at this as diagnostic. But in short, if there really is a connection between A and B, then people should know that. And a lot of education is about helping them to understand the connection between A and B, but asking them whether they see A and B as connected is kind of helpfully diagnostic.
Yes, and on that note, we went back to ENA Classic, the network of the expert and the network of the on the way to become an expert, and the relation between the two. I mean, I think this was great, Peter. Thank you very much. It was super inspiring. It made me think a lot. So when we close down here, some of us go home away from the office. Some of us are still at work. Let's think a little bit about what you taught us here. There's something about methodology, but there's definitely also something about culture and cognition and how this sits together and so on. So thanks a lot.
Well, thank you all. You're all too generous with your comments, but really a lot of interesting things. I've got to make sure I can save the chat.